All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Maura McGinty-Kloss, and I want to welcome you to the Natural Areas Association 2021 webinar series. I can't believe we're already in November of 2021. I'm Maura McGinty-Kloss, and I'm the Programs and Communications Manager of the NAA, and I'm delighted to have you joining us today. The purpose of NAA webinars is not just to convey information, but to engage those of you who are the professionals, topics of interest and areas where we can advance your work, the people who are doing all the hard labor on the ground to preserve our natural areas. Just to let you know a little bit about our organization, the Natural Areas Association serves those who are dedicated to the management and restoration of biologically important natural areas in North America. We protect nature by providing the reliable science that informs practices on the ground, and a network of stewards like you who work tirelessly to protect, manage, and restore land and biodiversity. We're an engaged community of peers and colleagues who become a resource to each other, who can respond to questions, propose ideas, share methodologies, and advance best practices. We've been doing this work for over 40 years, and we're delighted to keep doing this by helping you out through webinars, through our Natural Areas Association Journal, through our Natural Areas Conference, and many other program opportunities. If you're joined today and you're a member, you know that you have free access to all of our webinars and all the archives. If you paid to join us today, we want to let you know that as a result of your payment to participate in this webinar, you will get a 7-day trial and access to the NAA webinar archives. So we encourage you to go in and see what's available to our members. If you decide to join within this 7-day period, it will only be $50. We will take the $29 you spent to participate in this webinar, apply it to your annual membership, and then you'll have access to everything. 3 webinars pays for, if you pay for 3 webinars, you've basically paid for a whole year. So it's a real bargain. The one thing that you do get with a membership is access to the Natural Areas Journal. So I just wanted to let everybody know the October issue is available. Members, you have access not only to this issue, but also to all of our past issues. And non-members, you would have access to any articles that are open access. So I encourage you all to visit Bio1 or the NAA website. You'll see the link and you can explore the Natural Areas Journal. So I now want to just tell you some of our upcoming webinars. We have one in December being presented by Elizabeth Olson, Rare Plant Propagation and Reintroduction. This is based on a document that was just published in New Jersey, and we're excited to be able to share it with all of you. And then in February, we have What's That Smell? How detection dogs are lending a paw to conservation programs. And so that one is both lighthearted, incredibly cute, and good science. So isn't that great? And then January, I don't have a graphic for that, but in January, we will be hosting a virtual workshop talking about topics in public access, particularly in high elevation areas, protecting rare plant species and environment habitats. And then also we will have another webinar, and when we have that, we will share that with you. I also just want to call your attention to the Natural Areas Conference. It's going to be September 6 through 8, 2022. It will be in person, hooray! And it will be in Duluth, Minnesota. So we are inviting all of you to mark your calendars and plan to join us. And also, I want to let you know that we're excited that Robin Wall-Kimmerer will be our keynote, and call for proposals are open. So the deadline is March 1st, but please don't wait that long. We want to hear from you. We want you to be a part of the program. So field workshops, hands-on workshops, plenary sessions, breakouts. We want to hear what programming you would like to see and what you can present. So please send us a call for fill in an application for a call for proposal in the call for proposals. So now I want to turn to our speaker today. Dr. Desiree Narango is a wildlife ecologist who studies how birds bees, butterflies, moths, and other wildlife use novel landscapes significantly altered by people, such as urban forests, residential yards, and farmland. Her ultimate goal is to find data-driven conservation solutions for land managers to help preserve biodiversity and species interactions in a rapidly changing world. Dr. Narango is a 2020 David H. Smith Conservation Research Fellow and a postdoctoral researcher in the biology department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her current research focuses on understanding habitat and diet relationships of insectivorous migratory birds and urban and urbanizing forests in New England. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to you, Desiree.
Thank you so much, Moira. Let's get my screen up here now. Great. So you should see this now. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I just want to say real quick that that conference looks amazing, and Robin Wall Kimmerer's talks are transformative. So I'm gonna have to definitely check that out. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you all today about a little bit of my research looking at informed plant selection. And I have to admit that I have a lot of information that I'm going to be throwing at you about the last 5 or 8 years of some of my work in this area. And so if you are listening to this talk and you have questions, or if you have clarifications that you need, by all means, I encourage you to feel free to send me an email. You can also visit my website and get any of my papers, access to any of these papers. And especially, for you land managers that are out there, if I'm going through my research and you're like, man, I've got this question and you didn't even touch on that at all, I want to know, about this tree or that tree. I also encourage you to reach out, because those conversations can be some of the most informative for me as a researcher to figure out what folks on the ground need to know. So without further ado, when Moira introduced me, she said that I work in human-dominated landscapes, which, if you think about it, is basically everywhere, because to support our growing population and our consumerism society, we have rapidly and dramatically transformed the world. And with that comes really cascading impacts on habitat quality for wildlife. Which is where I basically come in. So as an ecologist, I like to call myself an interaction ecologist, because I study interactions between plants and animals, how they interact with their environment, but also how they interact with people on land uses that people also need to survive. And so, my goal is really to find these conservation solutions that we can then use so that we can share these landscapes with people and wildlife. And, if we look at some of these different land uses, like urban, that can be about 3% of the United States. We can talk about things like residential yards, which is a lot of my research has focused on. That can be 10 to 15% of the United States, at least in the continental United States. Our unprotected forests, so these are privately owned forests that are not managed by a public municipality, that can be 30% in the United States. And when we add this all up across all of the United States, it can be we have 60% of our land is locked up in privately used land uses. And these areas have a lot of potential to support biodiversity. And so in order to really improve these areas, we have to study them, but we also need to provide recommendations for how these properties should be managed, especially because they're much more novel than other more natural land uses. And so we are also facing really dramatic biodiversity declines across the globe that can be extremely alarming. And one of the ones that I'm sure that you've seen in papers that you're reading and in the media are these dramatic insect declines. And with insect declines, not only do these species have intrinsic value in their own right, as, members of an ecosystem, but they also provide a lot of really important services to people like pollination, pest control, and decomposition. These insects can also have a lot of really important cultural value for people as well. And, the most important thing from my perspective is their contributions to food web function. And so when we see declines like our lepidopteran species that are experiencing some of the most dramatic declines, that can be really alarming for anything that relies on these insect species for food. There was a paper that came out in PNAS last year that talked about all the different mechanisms of insect decline. And in a depressing way, David Wagner called it death by 1,000 cuts. And what he meant by that is just that there's a lot of mechanisms that are contributing to these declines, from fire to storm intensity, of course, climate change, droughts, pollution, non-native species, urbanization. The list goes on. All of these are contributing to the losses of insect biomass that we see. But when I looked at this list that Wagner shared, I'm a conservation optimist, so I look for optimism wherever I can. And one of the things that I was optimistic about is that if we think about some of these different mechanisms, like species interactions, and of course, climate change, non-native species, deforestation, a lot of these have to do with plant communities. And so one way that we might be able to simultaneously combat multiple mechanisms at the same time is to start rethinking what our relationship is with plant communities in the land that we share with biodiversity. Because if you think about it, in areas like the land that you manage or your yards or in urban areas, all of these small planting decisions, such as how many times do you mow, what kind of tree do you plant, do I put a garden in, all of these small planting decisions has had the additive effect of completely transforming the identity, the assemblages, the diversity of the plant communities that have survived to occupy the present day. So in this way, I would argue that the way that we manage those plant communities is really the primary way that we can support biodiversity. And so what decisions that we make can have a lot of implications on which species are able to use a particular piece of land. One reason for that, from the perspective of our pollinating insects, is that more than 90% of our plant-eating insects are specialists to some degree. So especially when I'm referring here is things like butterflies and moths that spend the majority of their life cycle as a plant-eating caterpillar. But of course, there's lots of other insect diversity that relies on plants at some point in the annual cycle. And the reason that these plant-eating insects are specialists is because these insects have adapted over evolutionary time to feed on very particular host plants, that they've overcome those nasty defensive chemical compounds that are found in the leaf of the plant, but they also adapt to the phenology or the timing of that plant, as well as the morphology of that plant as well, as you can see with this double-tooth prominent here that feeds exclusively on elm leaves. And our specialism can take a lot of different forms. So in butterflies and moths, we can have some species like the juniper hairstreak, which in the eastern United States can only use really one plant in the juniper family, which is red cedar. We can also have moths that will specialize for really anything that's in a genus, like the rosy maple moth that specializes on maple trees. And so really they can use pretty much any species that's in that genus, but we also know that they can have preferences for particular identities of plants. So up here in Massachusetts, our rosy maple moths really like sugar maple. So we really want to keep those sugar maples in the landscape. And then we can have species that, if we look across their entire distribution, they can seem to be pretty generalized, like the Promethea moth, which uses over a dozen different plant families across its entire range. But we know with Promethea moth in particular that depending on where you are in the distribution, they can have very specialized regional specialization. So again, up here in Massachusetts, Prometheas are specializing on prunus, the cherry trees, and sassafras. But if you go down to the mid-Atlantic, they really like tulip trees, which are more abundant down there. And then if you go even farther down to the southeastern US, they feed very heavily on magnolia trees, which we don't have really at all. So you can see it really depends on where you are of how many plants a species might need to use. I also want to emphasize, just because I thought this was amazing when I found this out, is that our bees can also be plant specialists. So here in the Eastern United States, more than 30% of our native bees are considered pollen specialists. So there's very particular pollen that they need in order to feed their brood. And if you go out to more diverse areas in the Western United States, there's a lot more plant specialists in our bee communities. So we need to think about plant identity when we are managing or gardening for our bee pollinators as well. And of course, plant identity also matters to our birds, not just because of seeds or fruit that they might rely on, but that the majority of our birds require insects, at least in some point in the annual cycle. In fact, if we look globally at all of the songbirds across the world, we see that more than 70% of them eat mostly insects in their diet. And this is because insects are incredibly nutritious, which is wonderful for raising young. And we see again and again that some insects, like caterpillars, are disproportionately important for these songbirds because they have a lot of protein and they're just a power pack a biomass of food in order to sustain them across the year. So in this way, managing, or rather our bird conservation, is really intimately connected to insect conservation. And then our insect conservation is then built on those plant communities. So again, what we decide is going to have a lot of implications. I added this slide in here just because I think this is a pretty telling graph that came out recently in Ornithological Applications. They basically took the data from that recent science paper of the 3 billion bird decline, and they looked at the number of species that had declining relationships and the ones that were doing the ones that didn't have declining relationships. And they found that for the majority of the bird species, where insects were an essential component of their diet, so the ones that we would call insectivores, across the board, the average change in species, according to this analysis, was almost declining across the board. So it really kind of shows that some of these biodiversity declines that we see in insects can also have potential cascading effects on insectivorous birds as well. And so again, like I said, these plants that we cultivate are really the foundation for the rest of the biodiversity that we support. And what I'm going to argue here today is that if we inform our plant selection, that can be really the key to restoring biodiversity and ecosystem health. And so what do I mean by informed plant selection? So basically what I mean is providing recommendations as well as quantitative recommendations that can help you make the decisions that you're making in your everyday management. Because we all know that you have lots of things that you're considering, such as habitat suitability. You might have sun or soil limitations. You might be thinking about climate resilience. And so we want to make sure that biodiversity conservation is part of that equation as well. And so you might be asking questions about, do I plant native or non-native species? Although with the audience here, I think probably most people are aiming for natives. But you might wonder, what species should I plant when I have a whole list of potential options that I can choose from? And so if we can provide that data or those recommendations to help you, then you can make a better informed selection that meets all of your criteria, because that's when we're really going to make progress going into the future. And so the two things that I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk are primarily the comparison between native and non-native species, and then going on what particular species or genera might I prioritize. And so first, in the question of native or non-native plants, we have seen in the literature again and again that if we compare native and non-native plant species, that are non-native plants that do not share an evolutionary history with our native insect species tend to support lower herbivore diversity. They tend to support fewer insect species overall, and they especially are supporting a less abundance, biomass, and diversity of our most specialized insect species, like our caterpillars that are feeding on a very limited number of plants. And so a lot of entomologists had suggested that these non-native plants could have cascading impacts on any organism that relies on insects as food, but this hadn't really been tested yet. And so, I had the real amazing opportunity during my PhD work to kind of ask these questions from a mechanistic perspective of how these non-native plants are affecting trophic linkages between plants, between insects, and between the insectivorous birds that rely on these insects for food. And so I had this wonderful collaborative opportunity with Doug Tallamy, an entomologist at University of Delaware, and Pete Mara, who is an ornithologist at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. And then I came in as the plant nerd, and we had a great collaboration to address some of these questions in residential yards in the Washington, D.C. area. And so this is the part where I define what I mean by non-native, because that can have different definitions depending on what scale that you're interested in. And so for the purposes of all these analyses that I'm going to show you, we defined a native species as one that has a natural distribution that includes anywhere in the eastern United States. So if a plant was naturally found in the western US or in other countries, then we called that a non-native plant. And so for most of the comparisons, we were interested in comparing trees at an individual level, but also at the territory level for these birds. And so in order to quantify the amount of non-native plant biomass that was available for an insectivorous bird, we used iTree surveys, which is a protocol through the US Forest Service, and then use that information to calculate foliage volume for native and non-native plants. And so what we found originally, one of the first analyses that we did was looking at caterpillar biomass between native and non-native plant species. And we found that, yes, the diversity differences that entomologists found before translated into differences in biomass, which is what would matter from a foraging bird's perspective. And we found that caterpillars tend to be 2 to 3 times more abundant. My colleagues have found that these native species are 5 times more diverse on native plants. But we've also done a lot of analyses kind of going beyond just these caterpillars, looking at spiders, looking at ants, looking at all the different insect diversity that's found on these native plants. And we see that pretty much across the board, there's more diversity and more biomass on native plants. And so when we looked at foraging observations of different birds that were in the area, we found that overwhelmingly they were choosing native plants over non-native plants, and especially for our target species, which was the Carolina chickadee. And we can, with this bar graph, we can see that it almost mirrors what's available for food. So, which makes sense from a bird's perspective, it's not worth your time to feed on something that's not going to provide you with any food. In those analyses, we included all native species and non-native species, but a lot of times I have particular questions about non-native congeners, which are the non-native species that are directly related to our native species. And so, theoretically, we could think that because they're so closely related, they should be able to support the native insect community. But what we find is that these non-native cousins are supporting about 40% fewer caterpillars, about 50% fewer species. So they're not the ecological equivalent of our native species that are found naturally in this area. And I have a student that is working on a paper, not published yet, but I think it's very exciting. He's finding that when we force these caterpillars to feed on non-native plants and compare them to the ones that are feeding on natives, we see that they suffer a higher mortality and they're also growing slower as well. So up here is an example in Promethea moth for caterpillars that are grown at the same amount of time on a native black cherry and a non-native Yoshino cherry, we can see big differences in how much these caterpillars are able to grow. So building off of these differences in the insect community, we wanted to ask, are there consequences to songbirds when non-native plants are abundant? So at a territory level, does it matter if these non-native plants are producing less food? And so for these analyses, we focused on the Carolina chickadee, which is a insect-eating songbird of the eastern United States, primarily in the Southeast. And for this particular species, more than 90% of their diet during the breeding season is insects. So there's a good reason that they should be able, or that they would be affected by any potential territory level declines in insect biomass. And so how do we monitor populations? We had to collect a lot of different data to make these comparisons. And I'm not going to go into all the details about that here, but first, we had to collect data on reproduction. So we had nest boxes out in different yards where we monitored them for the presence of breeding activity and how many eggs they laid, how many nestlings did they produce. And then we also looked at adult survival. So we were fortunate to have a 16-year data set of color banded individuals that could be uniquely identified. And so we could see if they came back year after year and then quantify the yearly survival estimates for females. And then finally, we had to get some information about juvenile survival too. And so for that, we actually used radio telemetry where we tracked little baby birds after they left the nest to see how well they survived until they reached dispersal. And then we can take all of that information and we can plug that into a population growth equation to see what are the effects of non-native plants on population growth in this species. And so one of the major findings that we found in this paper is that there were negative effects of non-native plants that were happening on multiple levels of reproduction, from whether the birds just even decided to nest in an area, which was actually the most frustrating result that we found, to if they actually did nest in this area, they were shifting their diets. They were also producing fewer young to fledging, but we didn't see any effect on survival, which makes sense for this species, which becomes much more flexible after they're done, after the breeding season. And so most of the negative effects that were happening for this species was occurring during reproduction when they were exhibiting this place-based foraging to feed their young. So as non-native plant biomass increases, the number of young that are successfully fledged from a territory is strongly declining. And so once we have that information about reproduction, well, then we wanted to know, well, if there's no effect on survival, maybe it doesn't matter. Like maybe it's okay that they only fledge too young. And so when we look at our population growth equation, we wanted to see what was the effect of non-native plant biomass. And just to orient you to this graph, this dotted line here is replacement. So that means that chickadees are producing enough young to support a growing population. And if we go below that zero, that means that that the population growth is declining. And so what we found is that as non-native plant biomass increases, our mean population growth strongly declined. So this line right here shows a pretty apparent decline in population growth. But you know, we plugged in 3 different models to produce this, and so we wanted to be transparent about that. And so when we calculated our confidence interval, which you can see here in the gray, what we found is that where this confidence interval fails to overlap 0 is at 30% non-native plant biomass. And so what that means is that less than 30% non-native, or another way of saying this is more than 70% native, these chickadees have at least some chance of producing enough young to support a sustainable population. But once you go over that, that's when the chance of that happening is so negligible that that it's essentially 0. And so when we saw this number, we decided that the way that we were going to write this paper was to offer this as a threshold. And so we suggested that if yard owners or land managers want to support insectivorous birds and biodiversity in their properties, they should aim for less than 30% non-native plant biomass. And so if they can reach that mark, then they're one step closer to supporting insectivorous birds and the food they rely on. So this was a pretty exciting result to find, and it turns out that a lot of other people were really excited about it as well. And so these are just a little bit of the examples of folks that have used this information in their management. I've had folks from landscape design companies contact me about incorporating this into street tree planting. The town of Somerville, Massachusetts recently passed the first native plant ordinance for the country. They actually are requiring 80% non-native species, native species, excuse me, 80% native species for their street tree planting. We've had Audubon societies and other restoration groups use these results as justification for invasive plant removal, for other restoration. And we've had a lot of initiatives to get private landowners and residential yard managers on board to incorporate this in their landscaping. And it's been, one group here in Massachusetts has kind of used this as a call for action to try to get people to go for a tangible step towards starting to support biodiversity in their yards. So that's been pretty exciting. The next thing that I want to talk about for the rest of this talk here is which plant species should I include? And anybody here who is savvy about their local natural history will recognize that, even if we think about just native species, we're not thinking about non-natives at all in this equation. If we think about just native species, there's a lot of variation in how much insect diversity that they support. And my colleagues also recognize that, and I was really fortunate that they were putting together a really impressive data set to try to quantify these interactions for caterpillars and the host plants that they rely on. And so in the end, we used more than 3,600 publications. Over 24,000 interactions are included in this data set for more than 2,000 plant genera, so that we could see just how many species of caterpillar do different plant genera support in different areas across the United States. And so this is just kind of an example for one area here in Massachusetts. You can see that the differences are pretty striking. From things like oaks that are supporting 477 caterpillar species, cherries supporting 415, and our herbaceous plants also have some power players like goldenrod supporting 131. And then on the other end of the spectrum of native plants, we have a whole slew of things that don't support very many caterpillar species at all. So things like tulip tree that for Massachusetts are supporting 19 caterpillar species. Huckleberry at 11, yew at 5, and many plant genera that aren't known to support any caterpillar species at all. That's not to say that that's the only thing that's an important function of a plant, but from this perspective, they are not supporting any species. And so we used all that data to look across the United States and see if this kind of skewed relationship was a consistent pattern or one that we just see in certain areas. And we did find, this is a distribution graph for the number of plants, or rather the number of caterpillar species that different plants support. And you can see that the majority of the plants in a region are supporting very little caterpillar diversity at all. And there's very few plants that are doing the lion's share of supporting most of the caterpillar diversity. And that it didn't matter if you were in Massachusetts or in Texas or in California or in Missouri, we were still seeing these kind of skewed relationships. And across the United States, only 14% of the plants that are out there are supporting more than 90% of the caterpillar species. And so, and also these distribution parameters, so how how steep of a slope we were seeing in these distributions was not affected by how many plants are in an area, how many caterpillars are in an area, what latitude are you at? All of these different ecological parameters did not affect these distributions. But when we looked at the identities of the plants that were coming up again and again in these different regions, we were kind of seeing the same ones come up again. And so I got my little oak icons here because you're going to see oak trees come up a lot in the next couple of slides as being kind of it always was consistently one of the power players in supporting most of the caterpillar diversity. And so building on just looking at distributions, we wanted to see what were the identities of plants that were doing most of the work. And so we used network ecology to really identify these restoration targets. And so there were a couple of parameters that there are a couple of metrics that we decided to look at so that we could quantify their contribution to these caterpillar networks. One of the ones that we looked at was network richness, which is essentially just how many species does an individual plant genus support. And I should also add that for all of these analyses, we're focusing on the plant genus. And the reason for that is because in the host plant literature, we just don't have the information at a species level. It's very data deficient for most species. So we had to do it at a genus level. All right, so we calculated how many different caterpillar species does a plant genus support. We also calculated how many, a metric of network sensitivity, which is how many species rely on only one plant for food. And so they would be expected to be extirpated if that plant were to disappear. And then we also calculated a metric of stability, which is basically a really fancy way of looking at network interaction evenness, or how many interactions would be lost if we remove that plant from an ecosystem. And we can then take all of those metrics and we can put them into, so this is an example of one of our metrics here for species richness. And again, you can see that the majority of the plant genera here are supporting only less than 1% of the caterpillar species that are out there. And there was only a handful that were supporting more than 1%. And here again, we have at our oaks at the top that across the United States are supporting on average more than 20% of the caterpillar diversity that's out there. So we took our three metrics, we scaled them and used them as a way to score these different plant genera across the United States in terms of their ability to support caterpillar diversity. And so what we found is that there were about 20 or so plant genera that are supporting an above, or rather had an above average score in supporting caterpillar diversity. And our top 5 were oaks, willows, cherries, our pines, and our poplars. And you can see here on the very left of this graph for our oaks, they're supporting, on average, they had a score more than 0.75, which was above and beyond a better score than any other plant that we included in our analysis. So now that we know kind of what plant genera are potentially disproportionately important for supporting our caterpillar communities, we wanted to know on the ground, does that really matter? And the really kind of tricky thing is that it would be extremely labor intensive and money intensive to try to do this kind of restoration where we actually went out and planted keystone plants and then monitored monitored the caterpillars that could use them. And I only had so much funding, right? So we had to use a simulation approach. And so we used a simulation so that we could look at what kind of caterpillar community could you potentially support if you increase the number of keystone plants, or if you just increase the diversity of plants, or if you increased both keystone plants and the diversity of plants. And so we basically just used a random iterative approach to simulate the caterpillar communities that we could potentially support. And so what we found, so we did this analysis for woody plants and for herbaceous plants separately. And what we found is that for woody plants, if you increase the number of keystone plants, that you get more species and more interaction diversity with fewer numbers of plants. And so if you increase the number of plants up to 50 genera, you would get about the same amount of benefit than if you included just 15 of those keystone plants that I showed you on that list. And so in this way, this is not to say that plant diversity is not important. Of course it is, because plants have lots of different function and a diverse plant community is more resilient. But it is to say that if we include keystone plants, along with all the other limitations that we have in restoration, we can potentially have a more efficient more efficient restoration for plant communities. So we'll be able to get at similar species diversity and interaction diversity with fewer numbers of plants, or plant identities, I mean. However, when we looked at herbaceous plants, we found that the inclusion of keystone plants actually had 3 times more value for the caterpillar community than just relying on plant diversity alone. And that's because herbaceous plants are incredibly diverse and have a lot of plants that don't really support very many, if any, caterpillar species at all. And so in this case, including 15 of our plant genera supported 28% of our interaction diversity, whereas 50 plant genera of just randomly selected plants only supported 9% of that interaction diversity. And so in the case of herbaceous plants, we really can't reach those same goals at all without including these keystone plants. And so in this case, including them makes it more efficient and more effective as well. And then finally, all of this was done using host plant literature. And so these are historical records of just observing a caterpillar on a plant. And we wanted to make sure that this actually did represent what we would find if we went out and did our own field work. And so we compared our literature metrics for Sussex County, Delaware, with a field collected metric from caterpillars that were collected on different plants in Pennsylvania. And we found that the relationship was pretty much a 1-to-1. This was primarily driven by these power players like oaks and cherries that were supporting most of the caterpillar diversity. So how important they are based on the literature is very, very strongly related to how important you are if you went out and actually collected caterpillars on your own. And that's to say that not only can these literature scores be, informative, but that also means that you can use them without going out and collecting your own data. So this was really encouraging to see this sort of relationship. And so when we published this paper, we emphasized that although we're just looking at caterpillars, by restoring a landscape for caterpillar diversity, that's probably going to be beneficial for other arthropods that rely on these caterpillars for food, as well as other, higher order consumers like insectivorous birds that are also going to rely on these caterpillars for food. But we didn't actually look at that in this paper. We are just suggesting that these keystone plants for caterpillar diversity would potentially be important for these birds. But we do have a little bit of evidence from previous work that would support that that's a pretty, we're pretty confident in these predictions. And so this is an example again, but going back to our chickadees before. And so actually I had another study looking at foraging relationships, and I used the number of caterpillars that different trees support as a predictor for how well the chickadee would prefer to forage on that tree in the landscape. And so here we see this wonderful linear relationships in native plants where the more caterpillar species that a tree supports, the more that these chickadees are going to prefer to forage on that plant relative to other plants in the landscape, which again makes perfect sense because the chickadees are going to go where there's lots of food available for them. And so in this way, using the number of caterpillar species that a plant supports can be a really nice quantitative metric that you can use not just to support caterpillar diversity, but to also support these insectivorous birds as well. Of course, this is only one study on one insectivorous bird. There's a lot of insectivorous birds that are out there. Which is where our research is going next. And so while I was studying these chickadees, there were tons and tons of migratory birds that were also using the same oaks and cherry trees that the chickadees were preferring to feed on. And in fact, in our urban areas, we had documented more than 50 different species of migratory birds, including many species of conservation concern that were using these urban areas while they were making their journeys north. And so we want to know now, our next research is really to look at, are some of these keystone plants like our oaks disproportionately important for our declining migratory species as well? Although unfortunately, as a scientist, research happens at a slower pace, so I don't have any results for you today on that, but I encourage you to stay tuned. That's work that we're currently doing here in Springfield, Massachusetts, where we're specifically looking at oak management in different urban forests to see whether that might help mitigate some of the negative effects on insect prey and migratory birds that we see in this area. And so we'll be using a lot of these same network methods like we used on the caterpillars, but combining that with DNA metabarcoding of these birds that we capture so that we can see whether these oak trees are disproportionately important and what that actually means for these birds' ability to refuel during stopover. So again, stay tuned. So that's all I have for you today. And so if you learned anything from this talk, I hope that you take home that herbivorous insects are adapted to feed on specific host plants, and many of our bird species are relying on insects as prey. I want you to take home that landscaping with both native plants as well as keystone species can make insect and bird conservation more efficient and more effective. And finally, that we can then use these interaction networks in management decisions to make informed plant selection decisions, because these sort of skewed relationships in species interactions are found across the board. So we can use a lot of the same methods that we proposed in this paper as a way to find out what plants are more important for bees, what fruit is more important for fruit-eating birds, or seeds for seed-eating birds. We can use a lot of these same metrics. And so thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions, I know I went through a lot, but if you want to touch base, please feel free to reach out to me, and please go to my website if you want any more information about the work I shared today. Thank you.
Thank you, Desiree. We do have a bunch of questions for you if you want to just take a quick breather there. I'm Lisa Smith, and I'm popping in here to help out with Maura. She had a little technology glitch in the middle of this webinar, so I'm going to go ahead and work my way through some of these chat questions with you, Desiree. And there are a number of questions asked, and I think they probably got answered in the presentation as I was noting, but I'm going to ask them anyhow, just in case. You know, clearly they were of interest to somebody, so we'll just get a couple of these answered, even if it means repeating your answer. So there were a couple questions about the rosy maple moth using Norway maple, and I think you did cover this to some degree, but could you just speak to that one more time? Here it is. Sure. You know, how that, you know, whether or not they eat the non-native Norway maple or feed on it.
Sure. So, so with Norway maple, when we just look at how many caterpillars on it and how many species on Norway maple, we see that there's fewer species and less abundant species, or less abundant numbers of individuals as well. So, but for rosy maple moth in particular, I haven't done a study on that particular species. I can say that I've never found a rosy maple moth on a Norway maple, but what you're asking is the reason why this student and I did this complementary research on Promethea moths. And so for Promethea moth, they prefer black cherry, but they can use any cherry that's out there. And on our campus, we have 17 different species of native and non-native cherry. And so that includes not just black cherry, but also lots of different kinds of Japanese cherry, as well as native species like beach plum and sand cherry that are popular in cultivation, but actually not really present out here in the mountains. And so we wanted to see if we force those Promethea moths to eat a non-native cherry, could it survive? Because if it can, that means that if females accidentally, lay an egg on a non-native cherry, that it could support, the population. And we found that for most of the non-native species, the mortality was so dramatic. It was basically like, this is not a host plant. So we had caterpillars that couldn't even get past the second or third instar. They just died. But we also had caterpillars on other non-native species that were able to survive to pupation. They just pupated at a smaller weight. And so that kind of means that there is some nuance on an individual species level, but we can say with confidence that if you have a choice between a Norway maple and a red maple, you're going to have a much better luck at supporting rosy maple moths if you plant red or sugar maple than letting your Norway maple go crazy.
Thank you for that. There are a number of questions about cultivars, and just to summarize, has any of your research focused on any of, specific to caterpillars in these native plants, any of the cultivars of these natives and how insects do?
Yeah, so we actually have a paper that was published a couple of years ago. It was actually one of Doug's students who compared native cultivars with the straight wild species. Because if you go to a nursery, it's actually really hard to find straight wild genotypes of, especially for the public that may not know specific places to go for those sources. And so what we looked at a lot of different traits. So not just, so things like variegation, leaf color, fall leaf color, disease resistance, fruit abundance. And for most of the traits, there was no difference with the wild types. The only trait where there was a really strong negative effect was in native cultivars that were bred for different colored leaves, like red or blue or purple. And so when we cultivate those traits, we're changing the leaf chemistry, which means from a caterpillar perspective, it's it's probably not as nutritious, or like doesn't, or there's higher mortality or something. So that's from the caterpillar's perspective. So we have a little bit of evidence that for most traits, it may not matter, but I want to emphasize that we have a lot of work to do. Cultivars can be complicated, and especially when we start changing like genetic diversity, we really don't know the extent that might have on biodiversity and on different communities and for things beyond caterpillars. I know there's been some work on bees that also shows that it can be a bit complicated. It depends on the cultivar. And then also with a colleague of mine, we're really interested in southerly genotypes. So like if I went out to my city here, you see all these street trees of red maple, it's like autumn glory red maple. They are not the native genotype. But red maple is native here. So what I want to know is, does that matter? Because we have a lot of people that are for climate resilience are planting southerly species, southerly genotypes. I don't know the answer to that, but cross your fingers for me that I get money, because then I will have that answer for you.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, that's really great work that needs to be done. Okay, I'm just going to skip down through a couple more here. How did you calculate the biomass of your plants? That question comes from Robin.
Sure, that's a great question. So we took very detailed measurements of the plants in terms of their diameter at breast height, but we also measured their canopy volume. So how tall is the leaf area of the tree? Like how wide is it? And we did that for both trees and woody shrubs. And then we could use that to calculate the volume on an individual species basis. And then we plug that into an equation to calculate importance values, which is a forestry metric. And so that is the way that we scaled non-native biomass from 0 to 100.
Okay, wonderful. I think this question got answered, but I'll just ask it again. You know, is anybody replicating your work in the Western US? You did talk about some work in Arizona. Do you want to speak to that any further?
Yeah, so there's no one that I know of that has done are you for the network stuff or for the native non-native stuff? I guess this network paper just came out and last year, and since then I've had a lot of people contact me from other countries and folks out west that are, that have field data that are like, oh, this is so exciting. Like, we want to start looking at what are the mechanisms, like, why is it that oaks are so awesome? And so they're starting to look at those kind of questions with other data sets, which is really exciting. As far as native, non-native comparisons, I don't know anyone that's doing like the real population level stuff, but I'm sure that someone is. But I do have a colleague that I'm going to give a shout out to who's in LA. His name's Eric Wood, and he had a really great paper on street trees for birds in LA. And he sort of found, although he was kind of emphasizing the native, non-native comparisons, he also saw a lot of variation between within native and non-native species, like we did for the chickadees as well. And so I know that he's continuing some work. I don't know if he's looking at population level effects specifically, but he's doing a lot of really exciting, interesting work comparing native and non-native plants and which street trees are great for biodiversity and stuff like that. So I would encourage you to check out his work, because out west things are very different, and for a lot of places trees are actually not supposed to be part of the natural ecosystem. So there's a lot of really interesting patterns that could be conflicting, they could be similar. So we definitely need to get away from that East Coast bias, right?
Super. Here's one for you. With respect to the all-star genera for caterpillar diversity, do you expect these trends to hold for other orders of insects as well?
Yeah, so that's one of the questions that me and Doug are talking about right now. So the only thing that I can say is that on an anecdotal level, I'm doing this work right now that I'm doing on migratory birds. We don't actually know what migratory birds eat. So I can suspect that caterpillars are probably pretty important in the spring, but we're studying them in the fall too. And there's a lot of insects that are out there. So I've been collecting all the foliage insects that are on different plants. What I find anecdotally is that the things like oaks and cherries that support lots of caterpillars are also supporting a lot of other stuff too. And so I would suspect, and also we've looked at spiders, and spiders do also tend to kind of, I don't know about diversity, but at least in terms of abundance, they tend to be most abundant on the plant identities that support lots of caterpillars as well. And that makes sense because, if there's more of the herbivores, that means there's going to be more predators. And so I would suspect that caterpillars are really great indicators for the rest of the food web, but that's something that we need to test explicitly, and also test across ecosystems as well. And hopefully we'll be doing that soon. The conversations are happening.
Wonderful. That's good to know. Folks, we're just about at the hour, and there are a lot more questions here, some of which are just clarifications of what you presented or questions about your citations. Desiree, I'm going to invite everybody to Desiree's email is right here on the screen. I'm going to encourage you to write that down and to reach out to Desiree if you're able, Desiree, to just field a few more emails from folks.
Happy to.
And then, we can, I'll ask you this, if you have 5 more minutes, I'm going to ask a few more questions. Again, it is the top of the hour. We appreciate everybody's attendance today. For those who did register, who yeah, obviously you did, you're here. We will have a recording of this webinar for your reference on our website. So, and you'll be receiving an email follow-up from Maura. But if you have 5 more minutes, we'll take full advantage of it and just try to move down through a couple more of these really excellent questions. I know I'm skipping over some, but just trying to hit some of these highlights here. So if I miss yours, please be in touch with Desiree. In Florida, this is from Gwen Brzezicki in Florida. We have a large number of rare and endemic plants that support only a few species of specialist insects that evolved to use them. Did your research include, or will it ever include, looking specifically at rare and endemic interactions? Many of our natural areas were set aside because they include rare and endemic species, and our management can't ignore these. Many times we find that management for these rare and endemic species also increase diversity of the community as a whole.
Yeah, so that's a really important question. So exactly what you're getting at is what our network sensitivity metric was looking at. So that, but we use a very fine definition of sensitivity. So if a caterpillar only uses one plant, and we take that plant away, that caterpillar is expected to be gone. And so there are plants that support, maybe they support very few caterpillars, but they support very specialized ones. And that's very true. And so that's why we wanted to do these kind of simulation approaches to see, in that case, it would mean that in increasing plant diversity is really what we want to aim for. But, the reason we started doing this work in the beginning was kind of that this is irrespective of natural history, just in a statistics sense. If you increase plant diversity, you're increasing the probability that one of those plants is really important if you were just randomly selecting plants in the landscape. And so, that's not to say the diversity isn't important, because I definitely recognize it is. But when we see examples of increases in species diversity with plant diversity, that's a big reason why. But if you're interested, in your case in Florida, we did have Florida in ours, but Florida is a very unique ecosystem. So the subtropical ecosystem was not well represented in the continental US. In any case of restoration, if you are interested in supporting rare species, endemic species, particular lepidopteran species, you're going to have to include their host plant, regardless of what its value is to the rest of the caterpillar community. They have to be there. And so by all means, definitely include those rare plants. We need those rare plants. But in your broader restoration, and especially for these really novel managed human dominated landscapes, we want to make sure that keystone plants are a part of that equation as well. That was really long-winded. I'm so sorry.
No apologies, please. This is just, I think everybody is really, and as you'll see from chat, once it's recorded, you'll see, Desiree, lots and lots of great feedback here. And I think folks are pretty pleased to have this information to inform both the education they do of the general public and the management that they're doing on the ground, especially when it comes to restoration and choosing the right plant. So here's just this hopefully will be a short one for you, and then we'll wrap. But would you be willing to just name some of the researchers off the top of your head who are doing similar work to you in the Western US?
In the Western US. Well, I mentioned Eric Wood, who studies birds. There's another guy named Forrester, who actually is the person that I cited for the 90% of the plant-eating insects are specialists. He's doing a lot of really great work with lepidopterans. There's folks in that I collaborate with at the in Phoenix, Arizona, who work in the long-term ecological research station that they have there, and they do a lot of urban work. We actually collaborate with them on different projects on bees and beetles and birds and all kinds of stuff. And it's really interesting where in the Western US, it can be pretty different what's going on, especially for bees. So I would look at what they have. If you're really interested in the West Coast, send me an email and that'll give me some time to think about it some more too.
Great. Yeah, I think that we're dealing with some we have folks here who are dealing with different ecosystems. And for example, Regina Johnson just states here that she's, the area Schwarzen's dominated by Doug fir, and native oaks are very limited, restricted, what would be considered keystones.
I want to emphasize real quick that network analysis includes the Western United States. And so we included 25 different states. It has Texas, Colorado, California, all kinds of states. So it's not just the Eastern US. Even, I have a little bit of Eastern US bias because I'm calling in from Massachusetts, but if you want particular information for a state, on a state level of what tree ended up on top, you can look at the supplemental material in that paper.
Perfect. Yes, thank you for that reminder too. Okay, boy, lots of great questions here. But I do think we have to wrap. And again, thank you, Desiree, for a most excellent talk clearly on a topic that for our audience is of great concern and of interest. So I hope we get to hear from you again. We would love to get you back to report on more of your work, especially as it relates to how we're managing ecologically significant landscapes in this country with considerations towards all of these issues. All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much. And good luck in your work.
Thank you. Have a good one.